Today we have poet and essayist Sheryl St. Germain, a distinguished poet for many years and author of many books, and most recently winner of the Louisiana Writer of the Year Award. Her most recent book of poems is The Small Door of Your Death from Autumn House Books, and her most recent book of essays is 50 Miles from Etruscan Press. And we're delighted to have Sheryl here today in this virtual reading. One of the things that has happened is when Sheryl's new book came out, 50 Miles, of course, like all other events, the book tour that she arranged, which was extensive, and we were very much looking forward to it, was, I won't say canceled, just postponed and maybe reset in this virtual environment. So welcome, Sheryl. Let me ask you, first of all, tell us a little bit about how this book came out, how this book came about.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks a lot. I'm really glad to be with you, even though we're not together in person. Well, the book, my son died of a heroin overdose in 2014. And initially I'm a writer, so I couldn't not write about it. But the first pieces that came out were poems, sort of broken monuments of odes to grief in a way, and that was the poetry book. But there was a lot more that I wanted to say, a lot more about that complicated the notion of what we think an addict is. And so I wanted to write about addiction and recovery. I wanted to write about my own struggles with that. And I was never an addict like my son was, but I certainly struggled with substance abuse. And I wanted to complicate the story of him. I wanted to have essays that talked about his life as a child and the way that our public school system failed him. I wanted to talk about ways that I struggled as a mother when he was having such a hard time as a teenager. And so some of the ways that I kept saying different kinds of crafts, and also through traveling and things like that. I wanted it to be a hopeful book, but I also wanted to write something that gave a fuller picture of this person who was my son. And there were things, I thought a lot about, why this book, why share this, and I feel like he dies, so it's not a book about recovery in that sense. And a lot of books that have to do with addiction are books about recovery. And I wanted to say that there are lots of us who have stories that don't have a happy ending. It doesn't mean that we can't find some joy, we can't find something to hold on to that helps us go forward. So that was this. And I felt like I had also a very special relationship with my son, in that we lived far apart once he became an adult. And so we played video games, actually. And so there's a long essay in here about playing games with him and about our connection in digital technology. And he was a real tech person, and I think he would enjoy the fact that I am now forced to talk about this book digitally, because that was the thing that he loved the most. So those are just a few of the things I was thinking about when I wrote the collection.
You point out, Sheryl, that not all endings have to be happy endings, and I feel like, in general, usually in this genre, there is that expectation of an arc that I think in some ways fails us at the heart, in the sense that it seems to make something complete which remains poignantly incomplete and difficult to accept. And I think that quality of 50 Miles is the thing that really distinguishes it, because it is a book that is not, impossibly, it is not sentimental. And there's nothing that feels as if it were constructed. And yet at the same time, it radiates this sense of what Yeats called cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by. And that tension between the deep, incredible closeness of mother and son, and then that distance of being a poet and having all of the agency of language at your disposal is one of the things that makes that book so important to us as writers, as readers, and as human beings. And I'm just wondering, in terms of how it interacts with your poetry, what was the you wanted to give a fuller picture of Gray's life, but how, I mean, so much of the work is poetic in its tone. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. As poets who write prose, poets who write sentences.
Yeah. First of all, I love the sentence, and one of the first things I often teach in my poetry workshops is the prose poem, because I feel like students need to learn what the sentence is before they start chopping it up, you know. And so I've always loved the prose poem, and I've written a lot of prose poetry, and I think that I would say that most of the essays in this collection are what I would call lyric essays. And I sometimes define lyric essays as, you know, poetry with their really comfortable clothes on, you know. Just sort of, you can use a lot of the same devices that you use in a poem in a more relaxed way, because you don't have the strictures of a certain kind of form, or even with non-formal poetry, there's always the expectation that lines are going to be of a certain length, and so I love to write essays that I think work like poems, but they look like essays. And part of that is just, you know, after writing for such a long time, I've, you know, I really love Pablo Neruda. And Neruda, when he first started writing, he had these very complex and beautiful and dense poems, the Residencia en la Tierra, for example. But then he moved later in life to the Odes Elementales, the simpler poems, and I like that because he was going to reach more people, and of course that's what he wanted to do. He was communist, you know. But I too have this desire to reach more people, and I know that, for example, my sisters wouldn't read a poem, but they might read an essay that fools them into thinking it's an essay, but it acts on them like a poem. There's also just things you can do in an essay that I find it difficult to do in poems. Just having conversations, for example, and reflection. And there's a kind of almost philosophizing that I don't think belongs in a poem, but you can do in a lyric way in an essay. So I think whenever I sit down to write, I don't know if it's going to be a poem or an essay. And I can tell you lots of things that I've written started out as poems, and then I was like, you know what, those line breaks are really random. Let's just make this into a prose poem. It's just, and vice versa. Sometimes I started out writing something in prose and I realized it wanted to be a poem. And these days, I'm not so sure about these labels that we have for things. You know, there is at least one piece in here that clearly looks like a poem. There's a hiking to Wyoming after a death, and there are a couple of short pieces that you could call short lyric essays, or you could call them prose poems. I don't care what people call them. It's just that occasionally the poetry will scare people away, and I wanted as many people as possible to be invited to read this book.
And in fact, you mentioned earlier about students, and of course, for many years you've taught and directed the M.F.A. program at Chatham College. But one of the features of that college that I think is indicative of the mission you talk about, reaching more people, is the Words Without Walls. And you've also edited that anthology, wonderful anthology that addresses incarceration. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see your role as teacher, educator, literary citizen in reaching populations that oftentimes don't receive the kind of acceptance of poetry and literature that they deserve.
So the Words Without Walls program, we started about 10 years ago. I started it with Sarah Shotland, who's been a student and is now, since I retired, the director of the program. But we go into jails and prisons and rehab facilities to teach creative writing. And we started to do this well, I had a brother who had been in jail and prison, and my father had been a little bit, and my son was in and out of jail, and I just had a kind of soft spot for that, and so I thought that it would be a good idea to start a program like this where we taught creative writing. And as soon as I started doing it, and I know you know this, Bill, because you've taught for many years, it was so rewarding to me. There were so many incredible stories that the students that I worked with had to tell, and I especially became close to the Women in Sojourner House, which is a rehab facility for women who are in recovery and who are mothers. And I continued to teach in the M.F.A. program while I taught in this other program, but all of it started to come together, and I started to rethink what we were doing in M.F.A. programs, and we started to attract more people to Chatham who were coming out of recovery or who were writing trauma narratives or something like that, and so some of that stuff just got mixed up together, and I feel like it's something important that more M.F.A. programs should be doing, that we often forget, or we demean a kind of writing that is has based in recovery, or that is going to help us in some way. We privilege sometimes craft over content, and I have to say I'm someone who loves a really well crafted poem. I've taught craft for years and years and years, but I also think that sometimes if you're deeply inside of a particular subject that you care about, and you've had good mentors, you can learn to be innovative and make incredibly beautiful things that no one could have imagined you could have made given your background. If you're just attending to your life and the rhythms and the movement of your life. And so this is what has surprised me so much with the people that I've taught in jails and prisons and workshops, that they've found, and most of them, they're actually not bad writers. They're not, some people think, oh, these people must be illiterate. Most of them are not. Some of them are college educated and wound up there. But giving them permission to tell a story about their lives, or write a poem about something that happened to them, and then helping them think more deeply about craft is just been really, really inspiring for me. And I'm planning on continuing to do it. And the last essay in this book is an essay about that. It's because I did want to offer some kind of hope, and for me the hope is always in reaching out to other people. I wasn't able to save my son. I don't know if you can really save anyone, and I'm certainly not trying to save people by teaching them writing, but I'm able to interact with them one-on-one and be a cheerleader and a teacher, and that means a lot to me.
And I was privileged to witness that, Sheryl, when you visited the Northeast Ohio Pre-Release Center, women's prison in Cleveland, and they had copies of 50 Miles, and they were so engaged and enthused that they wanted you to come back. I mean, they were, because as you can see, I mean, I think that the book is a bridge as well as a beacon. It allows people to feel that their lives matter in ways that perhaps they hadn't recognized before, when they see it reflected in this.
I wanted to go back there too, and maybe I'll be able to at one point. But I remember one of the guys in there said he had the copy of the book, and it was all marked up, and he said that he felt like my son was a little bit like him, and he said, I'll never forget this. He said that the next time that his mother came to visit him in prison, he was going to tell her how much he loved her. It's kind of sentimental, but still, just that someone could find another person like them who was deeply loved and could see this whole process from a mother's perspective meant a lot to me. So.
Sheryl, we'd love it if you'd share some of 50 Miles, your book of essays with us today.
Okay, sure. I thought I would read the title essay, which is called 50 Miles. Um, so 50 Miles. In the early mornings of December 9th, 2014, a widespread river of fog descended over North Texas, surrounding the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolis and lingering into the afternoon hours. Seen from above, the fog seemed to swirl into itself, clotted into what looked like an endless sea that flooded the area, so thick that only the tops of the tallest buildings in the skyline pierced it. Dozens of flights were canceled at DFW. A dense fog advisory was issued, and newscasters warned that driving conditions were dangerous. In fact, the fog was so impenetrable in the morning that visibility was calculated at zero, making it almost impossible to drive. It was into this fog that my son Gray drove that morning, headed about 50 miles northwest of his apartment in Dallas to the small town of Decatur. He called in sick that morning to his job, although he told his girlfriend with whom he lived that he was going to work. A drive that normally takes a little over an hour would have taken much longer that morning as he plowed through a fog as nasty as any he might have ever driven through in his life. I don't know if he would have listened to the traffic or weather advisories or even paid attention to them if he did. He was driving to Decatur to visit his friend Bryce, a fellow musician and former bandmate with whom he still occasionally collaborated, and who was known in the local music scene for his woozy electronic dance beats. Gray had told me that he admired Bryce as a musician and composer, and I know he felt a deep connection with him through the electronic music they both loved and composed. Bryce was also an admitted heroin addict who seems to have made his living selling drugs. Gray, who had completed a 30-day rehab 9 months earlier, had been staying away from him since his release because Bryce had been his source for drugs. In February, at Bryce's house, he had nearly died from a binge of meth, heroin, and alcohol, at one point vomiting blood and becoming psychotic, attacking Bryce and his girlfriend. He would later tell me he thought he was a character from the TV show True Blood. He thought he had killed me. The blood he had vomited, he thought, was my blood. He checked himself into rehab 2 days later. After completing rehab, Gray sent Bryce a text saying he didn't want to see him again, that he wanted his life to go in a different direction. During a visit that summer, he had confided how scary Bryce had become, how he had deteriorated into a wraith-like creature he hardly recognized, that his music had suffered. I could see that it brought Gray no pleasure to say these things, that it hurt and confused him to see what had become of his friend. Bryce had become a pariah in the music community, partly because of his notorious drug use, and partly due to his selling and promoting the use of heroin, opiates, and methamphetamine. But after Gray got out of rehab this time, head shaved, shiny recovery medallion dangling on his keychain, he said he was committed to staying clean and sober. Life was difficult, though. He was unable to find a job for about 7 or 8 months. Too many petty crime arrests. An outstanding charge from 2013 for possession of a small amount of meth was still unresolved. No one wanted to hire him. He sent job application after job application out and almost hit bottom when even Jack in the Box wouldn't hire him. Finally, in September sometime, he called me in Pittsburgh, where I live, excited to report he passed a drug test and was beginning work for Amazon, a seasonal job fulfilling orders through the end of the holiday season. The decision to drive to Bryce's on that December day is a mystery. He had seemed to like his job and had made some good friends already there. Old friends and his girlfriend insist he seemed free of drugs, although he started drinking again. His decision is like a fog of epic proportions that does not reveal a path, though you shine your brightest lights into it. Indeed, all your powers of analysis simply seem to obscure the matter. That's the mystery of fog, as anyone who's attempted to drive in it knows, that it does not respond as darkness does to light by opening up a way, but rather just reveals more of itself. The powers of light are not useful in fog. The best thing to do is usually waited out, although few of us will do so if something we really want requires us to drive through fog to get it. And yet, while I don't know what my son's reasons might have been, if he had them, to risk his life by driving in dangerous weather to see a person who had become deadly for him, I can empathize. 35 years earlier, when I was just a few years younger than Gray was that December night, I fell in with a skinny, dark-haired musician with a handlebar mustache. I was a junior at Southeastern Louisiana University in Hammond, and Fred had just graduated with a BA in music. He was the coolest person I'd ever met. We both played guitar, and he taught me some unique guitar tunings and turned me on to some wildly awesome Brazilian music. He liked Joni Mitchell's music and impressed me with his knowledge of music in general. His collection of records rivaled mine in taste and breadth. At that time in my life, the things I was proudest of were my music collection and the few small songs I'd written. Almost everything else was gravy. To my soul, only music mattered. Fred and I met at a restaurant in Hammond where I used to tend bar. We hung out one night playing guitar and talking about music, and when he suggested we do some lines of coke, I said yes. It turned out he knew as much about drugs as he did about music. We stayed up those first few nights drinking scotch and snorting coke and eventually making love. Over the weeks, he gradually worked up to asking me to shoot him up, showing me how to prepare a shot, then asked if I wanted to try. And because I trusted him, he was so cool. He knew so much about music and how to do drugs safely. Clean needle, never share, he said. I decided to try it. And so we spent a summer shooting up coke and drinking scotch, talking about music, sharing records, songs, playing guitar, and making love. I became so bonded with him through the ritual of shooting dope and playing music that I would have done anything for him. When he said he'd be happier if I lost some weight, I did. I lost 10 pounds in about 3 weeks. When he asked if I knew anyone who wanted to buy some coke, I checked around. He sold some to my brother, who would wind up dying a few years later of a drug overdose. No one else knew this side of me. To almost everyone else, I was a third-year English major in good standing at Southeastern, a Joni Mitchell wannabe whose hobby was music. I did have clarity about wanting to finish college, but with respect to anything related to Fred, my mind was a haze. I couldn't see clearly what was happening to me, even though coworkers who spied the pinprick bruises on my arms expressed concern, which I brushed off in the way I imagined Gray would have brushed away the fog warnings. I knew what I was doing. I could handle it. So I get it, in a way. I get why Gray might have wanted to drive through the thickest fog ever to see the darkest friend ever, who knew things about him no one else did, to see a friend to whom he wouldn't have to lie. 50 miles of fog. Did he ever think of turning back? At some point, after a period I no longer remember, Fred broke up with me abruptly for another woman. From one day to the next, I found myself abandoned, depressed, and feeling a hopelessness I had never felt before. Hammond was a small town. I had already seen Fred in a couple of our favorite restaurants with the new woman, which stabbed at both my heart and pride. What to do? It felt like some huge action had to be taken, some purging thing. But what? I had a friend in Baton Rouge who'd come through a tough time on drugs and would know something about what I was feeling. I decided I'd quit my job, leave Hammond, and move to Baton Rouge with her, where we could share an apartment. It was only 50 miles away. I could continue to Hammond on Tuesdays and Thursdays to finish up my classes. I was as low as a person could be, my thoughts as clouded and black as they have ever been, but something in me chose life that day. If addiction is a river, I was still swimming in it, but I made a move to the shoreline that day instead of into deeper, more uncertain currents. That 50-mile trip for me was all about choosing life, although I don't know that I understood it at that time. I was lucky to have a friend who took me in. My choice will ever be a mystery, though, because I could just as easily have gone the other way. Everything in my genes was screaming for that other way. Father, brother, aunt, all fallen to alcohol or drugs, others of the family on the way. Why I didn't follow them, I'll never know. If I were a religious person, I would say something blessed me that day. But I'm not a religious person. Perhaps some part of me believed, as I still do, in the capacity for humans, even one as unworthy as I, to change. And the tiniest hope of change was enough to shove me just the tiniest bit that one day in a different direction. But I'm making this up. The truth is, I don't know why I chose life. I don't remember what the weather was like when I drove the 50 miles from Hammond to Baton Rouge that day 35 years ago. But I know I drove through a mist of pain and tears. And for months afterwards, I rarely spoke except when it was necessary. I wore all black. I even wore a black beret. It was as if something or someone had died, and I was in mourning. I drank coffee with cinnamon and listened to the Keith Jarrett Cone concerts over and over. I wrote horrible, sad poems and played even sadder songs on the guitar. I found a job at a jazz bar in Baton Rouge. I commuted to Hammond on Tuesdays and Thursdays and plodded through my coursework. I think I'm hiding my face. And slowly, slowly, I materialized back into a world without Fred, without drugs. Who knows what was in Gray's heart as he drove his 50 miles to Decatur that day? Perhaps he was driving through a fog of pain and suffering that made the literal fog seem like clarity. Perhaps he was so out of tune with the moment, with the actual world, that he hardly noticed the fog or registered it only as an irritation. Or maybe it echoed with some fog inside of him, some place he could never get clarity on, no matter how much he tried, no matter what light he shone on it. He had taken 2 packs of syringes with him, stolen from his girlfriend, who was a diabetic. She thinks he planned to trade it or sell them to lower the cost of whatever drugs he was looking for that day. The 911 call was made by Bryce from Gray's phone at 3 p.m. Gray wasn't breathing. The paramedics managed to get a pulse, but were unable to stabilize it, and he was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. The detective who handled the case said Bryce's house was clearly a drug house. It was filthy, with needles and empty beer cans everywhere. The detective also said the only mark on Gray was a needle mark on his right hand. Philosopher and former heroin addict William Pryor writes that, quote, addiction is a philosophical mystery, more like that of, say, happiness. Neuroscientists imagine happiness can be reduced to a chemical. Most of us know it is far more elusive, the proper subject of mysticism, philosophy, psychology, literature, film, music, and art, end quote. I don't want to give up on trying to come to some kind of clarity or serenity about my son's choices and my own, but I'm not certain I will come to the end of my life saying that I understand any of it. I feel compassion for his suffering and empathy for his choices, though I wish every moment of every day he had not chosen to get up that morning and drive into that fog. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Fred hadn't broken up with me, if we had continued shooting up coke the way we were then. I was already doing whatever he asked of me and had even stooped to selling drugs to my own brother. What else might I have done or become if he'd kept me around? Would I have chosen life if I had fallen so far into the river that I couldn't even see what life could be outside of it? Would I have driven 50 miles in a deadly fog to talk music, do drugs, have sex with him one more time if he'd asked me? The fog is in us and surrounds us, insidious, seductive, suicidal. A cloud river, coiled, coked, cooked, shot, knotted into itself, so deep you can't see your way out. Some of us, through happenstance, stumble to the shore. Others, their sights set on some prize the living do not perceive, lose sight of it. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. Thank you for sharing this occasion, and I hope that we're able to meet in person and have real readings, resume that book tour very soon, because this is a book that I think needs to be heard, needs to be read by many, many people.
Thank you so much, Bill. Enjoy seeing you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.